Okay, let's make this a historic event. Happy October, everybody. Welcome back to the 1455 author series. This is our monthly, sometimes 2 or 3 times a month series where we do a deep dive with an author about a new book. If this is your first time joining us, welcome and thank you for checking us out. I'm Sean Murphy. I am the executive director of 1455, and you can learn a lot more about who we are and what we do at 1455litarts.org. Simply put, we are a nonprofit that is dedicated to storytellers and celebrating storytelling. And programs like this are our way of trying to shine a light on books that we feel are worthy of note. So as always, it's a tremendous honor to welcome an author to discuss their work. I'm also happy, as always, to partner with our friends at DC's historic The Potter's House. Usually Lee Tivell, who's their executive director, joins me for the introduction. She's double booked tonight. So I am happy to say, as always, we are very grateful. We're looking forward to returning to some in-person programming, but we also love this virtual programming because we're able to reach, an audience anywhere, which is wonderful. A real quick blurb about the Potter's House. They're a nonprofit cafe, bookstore, and event space in the Adams Morgan district of DC. Since opening their doors in 1960, they've been a key place for deeper conversations, creative expression, and community transformation. I encourage you to support them in their mission, as well as independent bookstores. Pick up your books tonight through their page. We'll put all these links in the event write-up. And stop in if you're a DC citizen and check out their amazing space. Okay, so let's get right into it. This is the first event I've done in so long where I really have been stressed out, not about the execution, but selfishly, am I going to be able to ask all the questions that I know I'm not the only one that wants answers to? So I want to zip it and get right down to business. But I'll set the tone by saying, I think we'd all agree that if it hasn't always been thus in America, politics is now a 24/7 situation, certainly since 2016. And those of us that are denizens of the DC metro area, which I'll point out, I'm trying to, in solidarity and neutrality, no political statement, celebrating DC, music, and our nationals, and the fact that there's October baseball. There's one elephant in the room when we talk about politics. It's been an elephant since at least 2016 and continues to be. I'm going to hold up. This is my advanced reader's copy. This is not, I think, what the actual book looks like, but I was special enough to get an early advanced copy, which I demanded. And as always, you can see the dog ear test to indicate engagement. We're talking about Donald Trump, of course. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to welcome back David Drucker, who you may remember from our Summerfest, where he talked about the art of storytelling as it relates to political journalism. When we first talked in July, he was coming down the home stretch, frantically trying to finish this book. So there's a little bit of a full circle this evening, and I'm delighted for him. The book launches this week. I know it's going to do well, but it should do well because it's important. And we're going to get into why it's important and why he did such an amazing job. But let me establish some street cred. I'm going to read his bio. For those of you that don't already know who this writer and journalist is. David M. Drucker is a senior correspondent for the Washington Examiner, focusing on Congress, campaigns, and national political trends. Prior to joining the Washington Examiner, he was a reporter for Roll Call in Washington, D.C., and covered California politics and Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger from the Sacramento bureau of the LA Daily News. He graduated from UCLA with a BA in history and spent 8 years managing a family-run manufacturing business in Southern California, which has given him a unique perspective on how what happens inside the Beltway actually impacts the rest of the country. He's a Vanity Fair contributing writer and appears regularly on cable news and nationally syndicated radio programs. He resides on Capitol Hill with his wife and 2 sons. He is the author of In Trump's Shadow. David, enough from the interlocutor. Welcome. Thanks for being here and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much.
There it is.
There is the cover with Trump's shadow.
I love being able to hold this up just because, there's kind of an insider sports
Correct.
thing going on. But yes, the real thing launched this week. And very sincerely, let me really begin by saying it's an honor to have you paying attention to us while you've got a book launch going on. So it's a real honor for 1455 to be in the hot seat and put you in the hot seat to really talk about what's going on.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you having me. And we've had some sort of off-air discussions about what it means to write a book. I joke to people, because I don't like to take myself too seriously, that I didn't cure cancer. Being a parent's a lot harder than anything else I do in life, and a lot more important. But I've learned the hard way, I should say, that, if you write for a living, whether you're a reporter or you're just a storyteller, writing a book is the hardest thing I have ever done, and that I could imagine ever doing again, even if I'm lucky enough to do it again with the experience of having done it once.
One of my, the always quotable George Orwell, one of my favorite quotes of his, and I'm going to butcher it because I don't have it in front of me, but you'll get the idea, is writing a book is like a long, hideous illness, and one would never undertake such a ridiculous adventure unless one was compelled by some demonic force to do so. So I think one thing all writers that have actually seen a book through cocktail party discussion to publication is a real obsessive drive, because there's a lot more involved than people realize.
Yeah, exactly.
So congratulations on that front alone. There's a lot more for you to be congratulated for, but in all sincerity, getting it done is something that, many, many, many thousands of people genuinely wish to do and just don't have the tenacity to make it happen. So yeah, it is a real achievement. But look, you're the type that's not going to accept flattery, but I'm going to insist on it. This is a significant achievement, and it's a very timely book, which was why one of the many reasons I was really excited to book you. And I don't think I need to justify or really set up our conversation, but it ties together what we talked about in the summer, which is, I think people tend to kind of, especially in the digital age, overlook the fact that there are many ways to storytell, or put in a more cynical way, that storytelling is happening even or especially when people don't realize it. So with all this information freely available and this info overload, kind of our default setting now, having people with boots on the ground that are making sense out of the chaos is real public service, and it's invaluable. So I think the number one benefit for anyone, and why I would recommend anyone reading this book, is, as a self-avowed political junkie, I figure I've got my finger somewhat on the pulse, almost not by choice. And I learned tons that I didn't know from reading this book. So anybody that wants to get a handle on the current political landscape and where we're headed owes it to themselves to get this book. So the first question I'd have for you, David, is, when did you realize that this had to be a book and about this topic?
Well, it's a great question. And, I spent 2019, in addition to all of the other political reporting that I was doing for the Examiner, I wrote a couple of stories about a couple of high-profile Republicans who were clearly doing things to prepare for a 2024 presidential campaign. I mean, it was unmistakable. It was very clear. In doing the reporting, that was confirmed, as obvious as it seemed to me. But, I spent, the first 11 months of 2019 writing one of these stories every couple of months. So that maybe amounted to about 3 or 4 stories. And I was sitting around one day, and it just occurred to me that the idea of Republicans jockeying in this shadow campaign for the 2024 nomination, even before Trump had run for re-election, before that campaign had reached its conclusion, might make a good book. And, I had pitched my agent 7 or 8 ideas, and he swatted away every one of them for different reasons. And, as we've discussed, I had never written a book, and he was trying to teach me what makes a good book. And I was looking for a good fit for myself, and I wanted to challenge myself. So I sent off an email with this idea that we have a shadow campaign for 2024 going on, even before 2020 had reached a conclusion. And after 10 days, I hadn't heard from him. I assumed that there I go again with another bad idea. But I said, well, I better follow up with at least one email just in case. And then he got right back to me on that second email and said, no, we like this one. This is good. And they helped me turn it into a pitch. I had to put this sort of on paper and I didn't know what to do. They helped me take my ideas and form it into something that they could take to a publisher. And 2.5 months later, we had a book deal.
As it happens right now, that's an important thing for a lot of people. And I know a lot of people watching this are probably already kind of painfully aware of how unusual that story is, which again, underscores both the success of your pitch, but also the relevance of the idea. And again, I think it's funny because even it is like metaphor within metaphor. Even talking about Trump, I think one senses whoever one's talking to, there's this exhaustion, and yet all things return to Trump. So I will repeat, I think one of the reasons that this book is so important is trying to get a handle on, what we know, or we think we know, via social media and the I wouldn't even say the 24-hour, like the 1 hour news cycle. We've got a bit of a handle on what's happening in real time. What's so valuable and what I want to kind of, showcase tonight is the fact that you are, a journalist that gets in there and is doing the real work and hearing the real people. Like, these are real sources throughout the book. I absolutely understand and appreciate anonymous sources when they're necessary. But I mean, you're talking to the players, you're talking to the people behind the players. And the thesis that emerges, right, is, well, regardless of what happens with Trump, the rest of the GOP continues to happen. And what I find fascinating, I'd love you to talk a little bit about is this notion of Trump is the prime mover. So when he moves, everything shakes, but we're also preparing, right, for the inevitability that he may not be around or may decide not to run. So is the best way to jump into this for you to say, what would take a top down and say, okay, so after all this research, and also I want to encourage people to buy the book and read it, we're not going to give it all away. Are there one or two people you would say have emerged, or as of October 2021, in your estimation and from the book, are people we should have our eye on, or people that we might not have our eye on that we should?
So these are the questions I get all of the time. I think the best way to jump into In Trump's Shadow is to talk about some of the biggest conclusions I reached, because what I set out to do, Sean, is write a forward-looking book, right? There are so many great books that have come out and are still being released about what happened over the past 5 years, and there are things we don't know that a lot of my colleagues are uncovering, and it makes your head spin. And it's very important that we learn what happened. But I wanted to talk about how Donald Trump changed the Republican Party, how he impacted the Republican Party, and talk about what that meant for the Republican primary to come, so that we, especially in a country with a two-party system, you can have your issue with one party or another, but neither of them are going away anytime soon.
Right.
And that is important to the course the country takes. And so the number one thing that came out of the book, on a thematic level, was that even if the Republican Party could throw Trump overboard tomorrow, right? That's not what the voters want, but for the sake of argument, he disappeared, decided to retire, or, they were able to send him to an island like they did with Napoleon. The Republicans who are targeting the 2024 race are all going to run by telling Republican voters that I will continue Trump's legacy, at least on a policy level. And, for people old enough, and I'm old enough, every 4 years for the past 30, 40 years, there was either a Ronald Reagan on the ballot or a Republican running for president promising me they would be the next Ronald Reagan. And these primary campaigns would be battles between candidates all arguing over who was the true heir to Ronald Reagan and who would continue Ronald Reagan's legacy more. And what you're going to see now is a break with that. And they're going to all argue in one form or another that they are the true heir to Trump, and they will continue Trump's legacy. Some will do it overtly. Some will do it subtly. Some will say, I'm going to give you the best of Trump without the worst of Trump. Some will say there is no worst of Trump, and I'm just going to give you Trump. Some are going to do it in their own way, but say, hey, this is me. This is me being authentic. But see, it's just like Trump. But that's what has changed in the party. And that's why it really doesn't matter in a sense if Trump goes away or not. Now, for the sake of current events and the way he talks about the 2020 election and the ramifications that has for the country, when you continue to undermine the democratic process and claim that an election was stolen, sure, it matters if he goes away or not. It matters if he's a figure or not, because you're not going to hear that from almost any other Republican, at least not a Republican. You're not going to hear that from any other Republican that's going to run for president in 2024. Most likely, at least not the prominent people that I cover. But for the sake of his impact on the party, it's irrevocably changed. We've had a break from the Reagan era. And that is what you're going to see in 2024. And I'd say the other big top line thing that I learned, and I get questions from people all the time on the left and the right. What do Republican voters want? Even Republican voters will tell me, well, I want this. What do other Republican voters want? And, you know, my Democratic friends, and I have so many of them, family members, what is going on with the Republicans? What they really want in a candidate, and this is true of down ballot candidates in 2022, and it's definitely true of the 2024 race, they want a candidate who in some way or another proves that they're a fighter. It's almost as important, if not more important, than these issues where you cannot cross the Maginot Line. You have to support the Second Amendment and gun rights, almost without exception. You have to be pro-life on abortion issues, or anti-choice, whatever your term is, on abortion issues. There are certain issues you can't cross, but almost as important is being able to communicate that I will fight anybody. And it's one of the things that has sustained Donald Trump inside the Republican Party is that he'll fight anybody at any time. And I mean, he'll punch down. I don't even mean it so much like, oh, he's so courageous, he's willing to take on anybody. I mean that every time he punches down or sideways or sends out a statement after a great American has died, criticizing this person that has just passed away, it's not statesmanlike. It drives people insane. Even Republicans who have supported him wish he would shut up. But for a lot of Republican voters, not all of them, but for a lot of them, even if they wouldn't have said it, even if they would prefer he didn't say it, it still tells them, wow, he's just willing to fight anybody no matter what. And that's who I want in Washington. He'll fight for me. And so thematically, those were the big takeaways that answer a lot of questions about the Republican Party.
Thank you for that. And I'm also glad that you made a point to illustrate that this is indeed a very forward-looking book. This is not in any way kind of a summary of the Trump years or a recapitulation of the highs and lows. But what I think is important in terms of the context, in terms of journalism and investigative, doing the research, doing the homework, you do have the context of this is where this trajectory for, say, Mike Pence started. This is the trajectory of Ted Cruz. And while you were just talking, there's so many great anecdotes, but one of and I think it ties into what you just said, David, the Ted Cruz, has had kind of wavering with the true believers, but the closer he's tied himself to Trump, the more pugnacious he's gotten. He's seen his numbers go up. And I have to think that that's kind of a constant reappraisal that all of these players, whether they're looking to run or not, right? I mean, look at like Mitch McConnell. I figured that this, and for me anyway, that was like the through line of every page I read, even with all these insights and learning things I didn't know and real inside baseball. That if I can't avoid the cliche, the elephant in the room of our consciousness is at any moment Trump could end one of these people with a screed. I can't say tweet now that he's off social media, and I think that so to me, this fascinating tension exists that someone, whether it's Cruz or Pence or whomever, Nikki Haley, could do all the right things, but on any given day, all of that could go away. And to me, there's like such a fascinating power dynamic there that has not dissipated since he was not reelected.
No, not at all. And it's so strange because normally when you lose the White House after one term, in other words, you're ousted and not termed out, you sort of, you're shunned. I mean, you lost and they appreciate your service. Now go away because you're no good to us. And, I was interviewing Trump in Mar-a-Lago and talking to him about this. And he told me, he described Mar-a-Lago as the grand central station of Republican politics, because he said, what I set out to do, Sean, was to let Trump speak for himself, to try and get inside his head. And, there's a place for confrontational journalism. I do it myself sometimes, but what I set out to do with this book was to try and tell the story of who these people are, even if we think we know who they are, to try and let them tell me what motivates them so that people could learn for themselves what they're dealing with and who they're dealing with. And Trump told me, I see more Republicans now that want to talk to me than when I was in Washington. And look, for a guy that would pick up the phone and call a random member of the House of Representatives, which is things presidents don't do, but he would just pick up the phone and call these guys all the time. Yeah. I mean, he was in touch with them constantly. And it's one of the reasons they liked him. He made them feel important. So here he is in retirement, so to speak, in South Florida, like other people his age. And Republicans are flooding into his club to hold events, but to talk to him, ask him for an endorsement. And speaking of Ted Cruz, I interviewed him the day after he had dinner with Ted Cruz, and he's like, look at Ted Cruz. He's down here. He wants to be around me. He wants my support, and he's not even on the ballot in 2022. And my point here is that what I learned from that is Trump is not always very strategic, and he just kind of acts on a whim, and he's like a political id. Yeah. But he's acutely aware of the power he has over Republicans in Washington, because he's acutely aware of the support he has from voters. And he knows he's capable of making their lives very difficult. And it's really astonishing in a sense. And I say astonishing because if you've covered politics for a long time, you've never seen an ex-president ousted after one term have this level of support inside of a party. And yet Republican voters did not abandon him because he lost, because he cost them control of the Senate, which he did, because of the 40 seats he had that he cost them in 2018. And he didn't lose their support because of how he conducted himself in the post-election period, refusing to concede, demanding that Mike Pence, his vice president, overturn the election, essentially, and refusing to concede to this day. And so it's really quite amazing the level of support he continues to have, such that you've seen it in the polling, and the polling's accurate. But I wanted Trump to speak for himself. And the number one thing I took away from is that, number one, he has a hostile relationship with his own party. Number two, that serves his purposes very well, because lots of Republican voters share his contempt, or he shares their contempt for their party. So it's cathartic for them. And number two, he knows he can drive Republicans crazy, and he enjoys using that leverage.
Yeah. And, so I feel like, you can sense, right? I feel like when you were writing this book, David, and maybe I'm wrong, and please correct me. I feel like even 3-4 months ago, there was a sense of he's saving face, in the way he does, and he's going to figure out how to be kingmaker, and, the things we're talking about now, relishing, you will kiss the ring and I will keep my eye on you to make sure you're doing all the right things. But suddenly, if he's making waves about, oh, I'm running again, it doesn't invalidate anything in your book. In fact, it makes it even more important, in my opinion. But how does that change? I mean, I think that's an obvious question, right? It changes everything. But do you feel like the people that you're describing in this book, that's part of their whole strategy? Like, that's a contingency plan. 2024 might be off the table, and then we just push this another 4 years.
Well, if they're young enough and they want it bad enough, they'll push it as long as they have to, as long as they're able. What I find interesting is in talking to some of the players and the people around them, they're not as willing to stand down if Trump runs as people would assume. Now, everybody is going to make a political calculation about whether it's worth the investment. about whether they can raise the funds to run a vigorous campaign.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't assume, because I don't think it's accurate, that Trump running means some of them automatically will not run. And I could see a scenario in which they announce campaigns before Trump is announced. And look, if Trump announces later on, they'll make a calculation. Now, if Trump announces, let's say the day after the midterm elections in 2022, that's going to force their hand. And I'm sure it will decrease the field. But there are many ways in which this can play out. And, in covering the prominent Republicans who want to run, who I think are serious people inside the party, regardless of what people think of their politics and how they've dealt with Trump's stolen election claims and all of that, they are full speed ahead. It's very obvious. There's nothing subtle about it. And I interviewed Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, very recently for my companion podcast to the book, also titled In Trump's Shadow. And I said, if Trump doesn't run, does it mean you won't? And he would not say that it means he would not run. What he said was, if you believe you should be president, if you believe you have something to offer the country at that level, then you cannot be dictated to by other candidates. You cannot tell voters that you think so little of yourself and your abilities that you're automatically not doing this if somebody else is. Does it mean he wouldn't make a political calculation,
right,
that he couldn't raise the money, or that there'd be so little oxygen he'd rather not do it? No, he could obviously make that calculation, but he's also making the calculation that he's not going to automatically stand down. I've received the same signals from people around Mike Pence. Whether or not he could win is a different story, but the mindset is very important. And I think that mindset is shared by more Republicans than people realize.
Yeah, and speaking of Mike Pompeo, I mean, so I'll concede that you were a little more bullish on him and his prospects than I would have imagined, and I wonder if I have a more shallow perspective than I thought I did, which is, he seems to me to have anti-charisma, and I wonder if maybe that would have doomed him 4 or 8 years ago, but he does have the pugnacious Trumpian vibe, and maybe that will serve him better than it would have, in a non-social media era. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you raised the point in the way that you did, and this was the whole. This turned into one of the major motivations for In Trump's Shadow, was to tell the story of who these people are. I did not go into this process expecting to write much about Secretary Pompeo. But as I did my research, what I discovered was that the Mike Pompeo we're all used to, and that includes me, the guy who gets into combative arguments with reporters, that just looks deadpan all the time, that's gruff, that doesn't use too many words, is not actually the only Mike Pompeo that exists. And I joked with him during one of our newsy interviews for the Washington Examiner, and this was not for the book. So I was asking him a bunch of what I think are pretty tough but relevant questions about Trump's foreign policy record and his part in that. But I joked with him that I had a hard time finding out things about his personal life and his background, because there's just not much out there. And he just kind of gave me this smirk, like, yeah, that's the way I want it. But as I did a deep dive into him and started pulling up speeches that he had given and talking to people that knew him, what I discovered was somebody who is really good at retail politics, can really hold a room, knows how to actually give up personal aspects of himself. And he'll give up, in a 20-minute, 30-minute speech, he'll give up one. And then in another 20 or 30-minute speech, 6 months later, he'll give up another. He told this one story. He was speaking to a group of evangelical Christians in Nashville in the fall of 2019. And he talks about the fact that, when he was young, he had visions of being a star in the National Basketball Association. Then he quickly realized he, couldn't jump and wasn't fast, or whatever he said. And when I interviewed him after we had finished, I said, look, I have a fun question. It won't bother you, but only if there's time. And we finished our interview. He said, oh, you said you had a fun one. I said, the stuff about basketball, I said, is that true? And he said, yeah, actually that is true. And it turned out, he grew up in Orange County, California. Now he's a Wichita State Shockers fan, of course, because politics, and he's lived in Kansas for a long time, and politics. But he grew up a Bruins fan and knew all about UCLA. And that's something I know about because I'm a huge UCLA fan, which means I'm a bitter football fan, but basketball these days is kind of okay. But, I had to go and find a speech and then kind of raise the issue with him. And then it was something he was willing to talk about. Then in some other speech, he talked about, his grandfather in Kansas. And, he ended up in Kansas because that's where his mother was from. So after he went to West Point, he was a lawyer in Washington for a while, didn't like that, went to Kansas to start a business. So all these things I had to dig up. But what did I learn? I learned about Mike Pompeo that there was more than meets the eye as a politician that might be appealing to Republican primary voters. And as I talked to people around Washington, they told me that they thought he was running the most interesting non-campaign campaign of this 2024 shadow race. And what I wanted to do was present that, and that people who thought they knew who Mike Pompeo was or who anybody else was would walk away with this insight and say, okay, maybe I still hate them. Maybe I'm never going to vote for them, but I know who I'm dealing with. And that was one of the goals I had.
Yeah, and David, again, I want to make sure it's clear to everyone that's paying attention. I mean, why wouldn't you get this book? Hello, but if you're thinking, well, what am I going to learn? This you do a very deep dive. I have like a dossier on all of these players. I'd say more than a half dozen. And again, like I said earlier, and I'm happy to say that I think I've got a working knowledge of the ins and outs. By working knowledge, right, as a layperson, but I learned a lot about some of the better known Republican politicians. Another one that really fascinated me and scared me a little bit. You were you had some surprisingly positive observations about Donald Trump Jr.
Yeah, so I expect this to elicit different reactions in different places. As a reporter, most of my coverage or most of what I have seen from Donald Trump Jr. has been his rather pugnacious, let's say, combative speeches on behalf of his father. His social media personality is completely combative and sometimes rather juvenile. And I set up the section in the Trump chapter about Donald Trump Jr. as the fact that, if all you know about him is what you see on Twitter, you might think he's a complete jackass who's a juvenile little kid. But as it turns out, he is really, number one, he's a really hard worker on behalf of Republicans and not just his father. Everybody that I spoke to in Republican politics, that including people that would have complaints about President Trump, would say Donald Trump always says yes when we ask him to help. If we want him to raise money here or raise money there or sign an email or do whatever we want, he does it. And as it turns out, he has established relationships with rank and file Republicans across the party, of all kinds, whether they come from rural red states or purple states. And he's a big draw on the fundraising circuit. I mean, he's raised up to $500,000 at an event. I mean, sometimes you don't see vice presidents getting that kind of draw. Yeah. And he's really worked this hard and learned the art of politics. And in a sense, as I reported in Trump's shadow, became his father's emissary to the Republican establishment, such that when there were certain Republicans that got crosswise with Trump, but it was clear that Republican candidate stood the best chance of holding a particular seat in an election, sometimes it was Donald Trump Jr. that would smooth things over with his father by just making subtle recommendations. It would be Donald Trump Jr. who would sort of lend his seal of approval, which is a good signal to the Republican base that cares about Trump's opinion. And he's just really become a sophisticated political player internally, even though outwardly he doesn't display any of that. In fact, it's just the opposite. in some ways, he's a much more sophisticated player than his father. I mean, his father was elected president. You can't take that away from him.
Yeah.
And there are certain qualities he had that allowed him to rise in that regard, at least at the time in which he rose. And of course, we could talk forever about why he lost, and just about all of that's on him. But his oldest son, of all the kids, is the one that really took to politics as a vocation of sorts and wants to continue to do it. And he's in his early 40s. I mean, he's younger than I am. He'll be around if he wants to for a lot longer. And he's created a situation for himself that, at least among Republicans that are in office in Washington, he's less toxic than his father.
Yeah.
He has more relationships than his father, even though obviously if his father picks up the phone, they're all, almost all of them are going to answer.
Yeah, I mean that probably, David, out of the I would say, well, more than a handful, but I mean, out of the real epiphanies from this book that I had, that was by far the one that jarred me the most, because it was completely unexpected. It was obviously, it's based on facts, and kind of terrifies me as someone that doesn't necessarily wish to see him thrive. You have to tip your hat to hard work, the connections, and the fact that, I came out of this book thinking, wow, if there's one person that scratches all the itches that are necessary, he's as close as anyone. But the one advantage I think he has over everybody is that he's probably the one person out of everyone you profile that his father is not going to, blow up. And everyone else lives in that fear, right?
Well, at any moment, Donald Trump can always blow up on you. And it's very difficult, because as a candidate, and this is just politics, right? This isn't the book, but you need to be your own person. You need to show voters that you're not under anybody's thumb. And if they think you're under somebody's thumb, they won't respect you and they won't believe in you. And yet, if Donald Trump decides you're not sufficiently under his thumb, he might decide to blow you up. What might, reassure people concerned about a Don Jr. running for president is he's not going to run for president in 2024. He has 5 young children.
Yeah. He's
got to put them all through school. So he's back at the Trump organization making a living. And I think the question for him is, does he end up moving somewhere at some point to some state where he could get elected senator or governor, if he ever decides that's a life that he wants? I don't, from my reporting and talking to people close to him, he likes the political work that he does now, but he hasn't necessarily decided that he wants to be in public office. And I don't think he really, in particularly because of the timing in terms of the age his kids are, and the fact that his father still has not called it quits, formally at least, I don't expect him to exert that kind of desire, if he harbors it, for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. So, David, what are we going to see, in 2022 that impacts the people that you've profiled? I mean, again, that's a very high level and open-ended question, but by that I mean, do certain, let me put it this way. I'll start. I'll put my cards on the table. I think it seems safe to suggest, if, say, there's a huge landslide for the Republicans and they regain the Senate and the House, I would imagine that does give a lot of encouragement to some of these players that are looking to jump in, because maybe Trump's impact is less, or the Republicans as a party are back in charge. That clears some of the playing field, or am I completely backwards on that?
Yeah, I think there's a different way to look at this. I think Republicans are likely to win back the House and the Senate, in part because of historical trends. The Democrats control the White House. Also, those margins are so thin. I mean, I think people forget here, Democrats have a 5-seat majority in the House. They have a 0-seat majority in the Senate. It's a 50-50 Senate. They control it because of the tiebreaker. Vice President Harris is the tie-breaking vote, so they control the floor and the committees.
Right.
I just think Republicans are more likely than not to win back Congress because of that, although anything is possible and it's still a year away. Yeah. But I think, number one, that Republicans winning back Congress and and President Biden appearing to have been rebuked, because of that happening, which hasn't happened yet, may not happen, but if it does happen, I think that makes, in some ways, I think it makes it more likely that Trump runs, because if he thinks Biden is weak, then he feels like he has a better chance of winning. And he'll take credit for the Republicans winning back Congress, even if he has nothing to do with it, and claim that it means that the voters regret ousting him, even though he claims they didn't oust him. And so you make sense of that. I think that because it is for now an open seat, you're just likely to get a flood of Republicans running for president no matter what happens in 2022. In other words, even if for some reason for Republicans things went sideways and Democrats retained control of Congress, gained some seats, and events could always intervene that make that possible, I think you would still have a flood of Republicans looking at this open seat, especially because in 2016 Trump boxed out so many of them. 2020 was off the table, and so I think you'd see so many of them run in 2024 no matter what.
Yeah, and in fact, I think a case could be made as you're talking. It occurs to me that if, and I agree, it's very unlikely, but if, say, the Democrats not only retain but solidify their margins of, I think some of these players could say, see, Trump's has lost the appeal. We need. I'm the one that's going to win back the blah 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 blah. I want to give a little bit of time because you also enlighten me. I followed the work of the so-called Never Trump movement. I'm curious. I'm curious in your estimation. Do you feel like this group has gained traction and influence, has lost it, or will it be? Let's call it the movement. So we're not talking about any particular organization, but does the Never Trump, and I'm speaking specifically from within the Republican ranks or does that force make a difference? Or if Trump gets back in, there still flies on the windshield? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time on the Never Trump movement I spent a significant amount of time on the Never Trump movement in Trump's shadow, just because I thought it was so fascinating that even though their numbers aren't hugely represented among voters, and even though within the professional ranks of the party they're not hugely represented, there's still a significant portion of high profile, lifelong professional Republicans who were at war with their own party and their own party's leadership. And I just found that to be so fascinating, and I wanted to understand what drove them, and I wanted to be able to talk about what drove them. And here's the thing: even though the party has no interest in going backward, and the Never Trump movement understands this, they still key players within the Never Trump movement did some things in the 2020 election that I think made a difference in the outcome, because they knew how to talk to disaffected Republicans that were still very conservative on the issues that drive their votes, but were just exhausted with Trump. And if what they understood is that if you talk to a Republican voter trying to convince them to vote for a Democrat as a Democrat, you may not know how to do that, but they knew how to talk to these people because they were these people. I tried to focus on Never Trump operatives that were still doctrinaire conservatives, whether on issues of abortion or issues of gun rights or taxes or national security policy, but just couldn't stomach Trump for all of the reasons that we've discussed. And in particularly, they feel like their fears about him were borne out in the post-election period in January 6th. So I thought it was important to tell the story of this sort of schism in the party and the quandary that this group was in, but also what they did with their angst and what they did with their opposition. Could they rise again? They could rise again. Could they be important players in a 2024 campaign if, let's say, Trump was the nominee? They could, but part of their success was predicated on the fact that Joe Biden, by disaffected Republicans in the 2020 campaign, was deemed as an acceptable Democrat who was not going to govern too far to the left. He was somebody they were familiar with, somebody they liked, and especially compared to Trump, somebody they were willing to vote for, even if he was the first Democrat they had ever voted for. I don't know if everything would repeat itself with the experience of the Biden presidency behind them and for them to consider. And it would just sort of depend on who the Democratic nominee is, how they feel about Joe Biden at the time, or how they feel about his successor atop the ticket at that time. But it is just so interesting because parties have evolved over the years. And usually what happens as a realignment happens is the segment that's disaffected from its natural home finds a new home in the other party. And we saw this in the Reagan era with sort of FDR, JFK Democrats who felt like they were too conservative for where the Democratic Party was going, ending up as Republicans. We've seen this go, we saw this in 2018 with suburban voters who often vote Republican, feeling more comfortable with the Democrats. But here you had a group of Republicans who felt too conservative for the current Democratic Party, but felt out of place in the current Republican Party, and they were trying to figure out what to do with that. And in the short term, what they decided to do with that was do their best to get rid of Trump as a president. But they still don't quite know what to do with themselves in terms of where in these coalitions they belong.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight. The other thing, because I feel like one of the things that I worried about when I started the book was the problem that all of us are dealing with Trump in particular, and I think politics in general, is I just think we're in an accelerated age where you can write something on Tuesday and it's already ancient history on Thursday. That's just, I think we've all made peace with that, which frankly, I think underscores the need for deeper investigative journalism and really reasoned thoughts and pieces that can stand the test of trends and time. The only thing that I would say, and this isn't even remotely a critique, it's just an observation. I feel like, having read your book, David, as I said at the outset, I'm positive it's going to age well, in the sense that people are going to glean a lot of insights in terms of, even no matter what's happening in terms of current events, the work you've done here is going to help people understand why certain moves are being made. The one thing that I think is a complete wild card is Trump's kind of recent threat tantrum about, if the Republicans don't do enough to re-examine to throw out the crooked vote, we're not going to vote in 2022. I'm not asking you to prognosticate, but is that a real concern, or is that more of, that was a fit of pique and even Trump knows that would be catastrophic? Or I'm just curious what your take, because I feel like the Republicans, the people in this book, and even the McConnells and everyone has to be horrified of that possibility.
They are, and they don't think it's a fit of pique. It's something that concerns them. And this is a great example of what I try to do within Trump's shadow. When I interviewed Trump in May, instead of saying to him, and I did this on purpose, instead of saying, "Don't you realize what you did in Georgia? How could you do that? What is wrong with you? This is wrong." In that sort of like combative way, I just said to him, "What happened? What did you do?" And he said, because I was talking to him about those special elections on January 5th, Senate special elections, Democrats won them both. And we knew from looking at the data and the turnout in Georgia that Republicans simply did not turn out to the level that they normally would have in a campaign like that. The decrease in turnout came from heavily Republican areas on two different ends of Georgia. And the Democratic turnout was, of course, off the hook. This should not have happened. They just won the presidency. Normally, in a runoff that happens after a big victory like that, you're so happy and unmotivated that you don't show up. And the out party says, "Gee, we better show up. This is the only control in Washington we have." And the opposite happened. It happened because Donald Trump went to Georgia and said the election was stolen, the system's rigged, you can't trust it, don't show up. And so I asked the former president, "Hey, what would have happened if you would have said, I know we're all upset about the outcome and we need to make sure there are changes made, but you can still trust the system. It's so important that you show up. Please go vote." And then he said to me, "Well, I gave 2 rallies, very successful rallies, but I suppose I didn't say it as strongly as you said." But people were angry. And he told me then that everybody's talking about 2022 and 2024. Nobody cares about that. They all care about 2020. And if we don't fix that or deal with that, then then these other elections aren't going to matter. So this is a common refrain with him. But again, in just asking him to explain him, instead of him, getting mad at me and accusing me of putting words in his mouth, I let him speak for himself. And he acknowledged what we all know. He was angry and he took it out on the Republican Party in the Senate and in Georgia by saying, see, I didn't get what I wanted, and therefore you're going to be punished.
Yeah. And does that go a decent, if not long way to explaining, the lockstep opposition to January 6th?
Yes, 100%. And I don't think Republicans have really learned the lesson of Trump. There's no assuaging him. There's no getting him to go along with you, because it'll work for a week or a month or a day, and then it just doesn't. And while you're busy doing that, he's not actually really happy with you. He knows he's got you twisted around his finger. I talked to him about this. At one point, I said, all of these people are, I basically, there's a good nugget in the book that I don't want to give away about a particular Republican leader. But what he basically said to me is, I know what these people are doing, and they are not fooling me. And so that's why, on the one hand, you don't have to go out of your way to antagonize him. There's a political pragmatism to not antagonizing him unnecessarily. But the idea of constantly trying to make him happy by infantilizing him. What do you need, Mr. Trump? What can we do for you? We don't want to upset you. He's not a child. He knows what he's doing. I mean, yes, I realize some people may think he acts like a child. My point is, he knows what he's doing, and you're not buying yourself any time with him. He'll blow up when he decides to blow up. And in some ways, the only way around that is to give him some of the things he wants that you can never give him, right? It's like on January 6th, when Donald Trump was demanding that Mike Pence essentially throw the election. Okay, Mike Pence wasn't willing to throw the election, and nothing else was going to make him happy. No explanation was going to make him happy. It didn't matter. And, Pence ultimately accepted that and understood that. And in fact, tried to make sure that this kind of situation was avoided in the future. But the point is, the only way to make him completely happy is to do things that are untenable. And he understands that, and he uses it against Republicans. The ones he tends to have a better relationship with, and that have a better relationship with him, are the ones that understand that and don't try and constantly massage him, that are just up front and say, sir, here's what I can do for you that you want, but these other things I can't. And I know that might make you mad. I don't want to be in a fight with you. Like, I like you, throw it on a little thick. I know you're great.
Yeah,
I love you, but I'm just not going to do that. And that, in his own way, he might respect that. He won't stop yapping about it, but that's the best way to deal with him.
right. Well, and along those lines, I feel like I just, even reading yet another profile that I learned a great deal about Mike Pence, his backstory, some of the just to give one example, I don't think I'm giving anything away. I was begrudgingly respected kind of the parameters that Pence set, and talk about reading the room. He knew Trump didn't have any interest in really governing or in the nitty gritty. So he actually had the opportunity to come in and say, I'm going to have my team. I feel like what I really crystallized for me is that aside from Trump Jr., Pence, to my layperson's perspective, has a lot of the fundamental infrastructure, but I feel like that is this revolving. At the end of the day, he didn't do what Trump wanted, so he's dead to Trump. I know that can all change, but that was my kind of, despite all the information and the understanding, I came to appreciate how Pence has set himself up nicely in a lot of different ways. I feel like it might be a non-starter.
Well, Pence has a lot of relationships across the party, and while he was publicly very obsequious toward Trump and hammed up the effusive praise of Trump to the point where everybody was wincing, right. Behind the scenes, he used that as a tool to accrue a great deal of power inside the West Wing.
Yeah.
And that was a choice that he made, was basically to lavish Trump with so much praise that some people found it embarrassing. But it also meant that he used that as a tool to create a power base, both with Trump and within the West Wing and across the party. And so the one real insight there is, even if you cringed watching Pence do that, that's not the only thing he was doing. And that also tells you that he's not as mild-mannered and innocent as his Midwestern, personality would suggest. He's purposely surrounded himself with a team of sharks, and he is very ambitious, but he's just got a little bit of a different personality. Now, can he get out of this vice he has with Trump? I don't know. And, he has other challenges as a candidate because he's somebody that everybody likes a lot, but nobody gets thrilled about. Mm-hmm. That's just politics. And that's a problem for him that he has to overcome or find a way to navigate. Yeah. But, again, the best thing he could do, I think, is own the decision he made related to January 6th and lean into his disagreement with Trump, because you're never going to get out of this. I asked Donald Trump when I interviewed him why he was giving Pence such a hard time. And he, the quotes are in there, but it's just clear he will never let it go. So there's no point in trying to get to a point where he'll let it go. Yeah. Use what you have.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's the ultimate question, I think, for you, David. You are the insider's insider. And I genuinely mean that as a compliment. And you know where the bodies are buried. You've seen the sausage being made. You can describe it being made. What is something that surprised you, or just one thing that surprised you, having written this book and going into it with your eyes fully open? Was there anything that even you were kind of had to reassess about your understanding of the landscape?
Really good question. I don't know if anything surprised me so much, but there were certain things that I found important. When I first started asking questions of Republican operatives and campaign strategists that are knee deep in campaigns as we speak, we're knee deep in campaigns as I was speaking to them. My initial questions started out as, what issues are the most important to have the right position on in a Republican primary? And pretty soon what they started telling me was the issues are less important than the attitude, right? So I emphasize, when talking about In Trump's Shadow, about how important it is to project a Trump-like attitude in the coming campaign if you're going to connect with Republican primary voters. And then, somebody in Trump world told me that even that is not enough, because if you're shameless enough to just say, fine, I'll imitate Trump. Yeah. Well, that won't work either, because if voters don't think you're being your authentic self, they'll reject you as an imitator and they won't want anything to do with you. And I just think that the fact that the party is in a place where attitude matters as much as the issues is something that's unique. Now, obviously, in any campaign, attitude and charisma and connection matter. But what I'm talking about here is a particular attitude that communicates that you're a no-holds-barred street fighter. And that is something I think that is unique at this level, at this moment in time. It's something that Trump ushered in, that had he not existed, all parties evolve over time, issues may change, but he really ushered in this idea of what it really means to be a fighter. And everybody used that word repeatedly. And in fact, when I asked Trump, how did you change the party? What was your impact on the party? He didn't even go into his, the accomplishments he could have gone into that were important to him, whether it was the Abraham Accords in the Middle East, making peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, or the tax bill, or renegotiating NAFTA, or again, whether you agree or disagree with these things, to him they were big accomplishments. To Republicans, they were big accomplishments. He said, I taught them how to fight. And this is just so central to the Republican ethos right now. And I don't know that I'd call it a surprise, because when people told me this, it made sense, but I never would have some things I kind of can spot when I'm reporting out a story and I have a good sense for, but I don't know that I would have gotten to that piece
Yeah.
had it not been repeated to me repeatedly by so many different Republicans that I talked to. And then Trump, without me saying, is it the fighting part? When I just said, what do you think you did? And that's what he said. And I knew that these guys weren't fooling themselves, that is exactly what has happened.
Yeah. And listen, I think that's probably, to me, that really brings everything together and solidifies the value of this type of research because of, I think America's favorite hobby on the left and right for the last 5+ years has been, how did this happen? Where does this appeal come from? I think your book, and again, the research, the quotes, the interviews, the legwork gave me a better understanding of where this disaffection lies. Because of course, for anyone that wants to have any understanding of anything on a substantive level, you can't just say, well, because people are angry or they're racists or, they want no taxes. Everyone has their own, issues, but the central theme is this notion of fighting. And I think, that certainly speaks to something that is larger than Trump. And shame on us if we're not paying attention, both parties, to, somebody, whoever it is, that's tapping into that. Some things are broken. And so I think it's cynical and unhelpful to just kind of dismiss something like Trump and say, yeah, that would never happen again, because there is obviously this feeling out there that's being tapped into.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I found interesting when I was reporting the Rubio chapter, Marco Rubio spent the past 4 years or so sort of what appeared to us, or appeared to me, and what I basically think what he's been doing is reinventing himself as a conservative populist and taking on a lot of unorthodox positions on issues, whether it relates to labor unions or tax policy or industrial policy, unorthodox for a Reagan era Republican, which he was. And when I talked to some people who were close to Rubio, they told me, well, that's not necessarily true, because if you look at his record in the Florida legislature, where he was Speaker of the House of Representatives in Tallahassee, he took on a lot of these issues. And when I was interviewing Rubio for the book, I said to him, well, a lot of people tell me this is sort of like who you've been all along. And he said, no. He said, actually, look, I come from I come from a Miami that is culturally liberal, but politically conservative. My parents were immigrants. I looked at America one way, and then I traveled the country campaigning for president and realized that the America that I thought existed, that the one that certainly was existing for me, didn't exist for so many Republican voters I was asking for their vote. And that, on top of Trump's win, kind of was a seismic earthquake for him. And he said to himself, well, this is what people want. So how do I tackle the problems that my voters, that my party's voters are having, and provide them with solutions? And it led to this sort of radical, I don't know if the right word is radical, but very significant makeover. And even when I gave him the out, in a sense, partly to see if he would take it, and partly because people that have followed his career believed that that's what they were seeing, he wouldn't take it. And, in a sense, what he was saying was, he was running all over America saying that, elect me and we'll have a new American century. And what voters were telling him in the Midwest and the Northeast and the South was that they didn't think the old American century worked out so great for them. So what do we want a new American century, the way you're talking about it? And so he's really set out to put policy meat on the bones of what we like to refer to as Trumpism. Now, I don't know if this is going to resonate with Republican primary voters, but it makes sort of Rubio unique in the field in how he's tried to tackle this from a policy perspective. And it'll be interesting to see if it resonates at all. But I just found his approach to this and his reasoning very, very interesting.
Indeed. And so, yeah, I hope we've whet the appetites for the political junkies out there, as well as people that are interested in a good story, because boy, there are some great stories in here. And David's alluded to it a few times, but he sat down with the man in Mar-a-Lago, and some of those quotes and insights are unbelievable. So buy the book to figure it out. David, it's always an open invite. You've been good enough you were part of our Summerfest. Here you are tonight, but this topic isn't going away. The importance of your book isn't going away. So I would make the open invite to you right now at any point in the near or semi-distant future as the contours start to fill out. Let's have you back in here to kind of kick around, what is holding true, what things you predicted, what insights that are in this book are playing out. And for all we know, things that are completely outdated because the world changes, so dramatically. But I think there's a lot more to discuss. So I would love to have more discussion going forward.
Happy to do it. And thanks so much for having me at 1455.
Well, it's our pleasure as always. Do me a favor, hold up your copy. I love holding this up, but there's the real thing. In Trump's Shadow, David Drucker. Go seek it out. Tell a friend about it. And listen, I'm happy to look right into the camera and say, again, I am a political junkie. I would never claim to know what I don't know, but I think I know a little bit. I learned a lot about this book. And frankly, I came away feeling a little bit better, which is, I don't think that was David's intent, but I feel like a better informed citizen with a sense of there's a lot more going on than the he is a bad guy that our media has been feasting on. There's a lot of things going on out there, and I think it'll give a lot of you some very positive perspective on the process. So David, until next time, best of luck. I'm very bullish on this book. I think it's going to find its readership, but 1455 is behind you, and we will certainly do our part to spread the good word.
Thanks so much, Sean. Really appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk to you soon, my friend.
You got it. Take care.
Take care.